The laughter cut sharper than the November wind. It spilled from the open bay of Hangar 12, where a cluster of airmen huddled near a disassembled F-22 engine, their breath fogging in the cold Nevada morning. Their jeers were aimed at a lone figure crossing the tarmac, her silhouette crisp against the glare of Nellis Air Force Base. Captain Elena Voss moved with purpose, her flight suit worn but immaculate, her boots striking the asphalt in a rhythm that betrayed no hurry. No one called her by name. They did not need to. Her call sign, Wraith, was whispered like a curse, and the scars, pale, jagged lines crisscrossing her neck and jaw, drew their eyes like moths to flame. "Look at her," Private First Class Tanner muttered, his voice loud enough to carry. "Wraith, huh?" "More like roadkill. Bet she got those scars tripping over her own ego." His buddies snickered, their hands stuffed in pockets, their postures loose with the arrogance of youth. Tanner, barely 6 months out of basic, had already made a name for himself in the motor pool, quick with a wrench, quicker with a jab. He leaned against a crate, smirking as Voss passed, her gaze fixed ahead, her face a mask of calm that only fueled his nerve. "Hey, Captain," he called. "Careful out there. Wouldn't want to mess up that pretty face any worse." The hangar did not go silent. It never did. Jet engines whined in the distance, tools clattered, radios crackled with static. But a ripple passed through the nearby crew chiefs, a tightening of jaws, a pause in their work. Voss stopped. She turned slowly, her eyes locking onto Tanner's. They were not angry, not wounded, just steady, like the bead of a sniper's scope. The weight of that gaze made Tanner's smirk falter, though he hid it behind a cough. She said nothing. She never did. She just stood there, the wind tugging at her dark hair, the scars on her neck catching the light like fractured glass. Then she turned and continued toward the command building, her stride unbroken. "Man, she's got no spine," Tanner muttered, shaking off the unease. His friends laughed, but it was thinner now, less certain. An older crew chief, Master Sergeant Rawls, glanced up from his workbench, his hands still on a hydraulic pump. "You're digging your own grave, kid," he said, his voice low, his eyes not leaving his work. Tanner scoffed. "What, her? She's just a washed-up pilot. Probably flies a desk now. Look at her. Scarred up, quiet as a mouse. Bet she's never seen real action." Rawls shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. "Keep talking, Tanner. You'll learn." He said no more, but his silence was heavier than words, a warning Tanner was too green to heed. Inside the command building, the air was stale with coffee and recycled heat. Voss moved through the maze of cubicles, her boots silent on the linoleum. She carried a tablet, its screen glowing with maintenance logs, but her posture, shoulders square, spine rigid, suggested a readiness that belied her task. The clerks and junior officers barely glanced at her, their attention on monitors or murmured conversations. But the senior enlisted noticed. They always did. A chief master sergeant, her silver hair cropped close, gave Voss a nod as she passed, a gesture so subtle it might have been missed. Voss returned it, her expression unchanged, and stepped into the briefing room. The room was half full, a mix of officers and NCOs gathered for the daily ops update. Colonel Merritt, the wing commander, stood at the podium, his voice droning through a list of sortie schedules and fuel allocations. Voss took a seat near the back, her tablet resting on her knee, her eyes scanning the room. She noted the postures, the glances, the unspoken hierarchies. She always did. It was habit, hard-won, from years in places where a single misread could cost lives. Merritt's briefing hit a snag when he mentioned a glitch in the new drone swarm protocol. "The targeting system's lagging," he said, frowning at a schematic projected behind him. "We're losing precision at high speeds. Intel says it's a software issue, but they're stumped." The room shifted, officers exchanging glances, none eager to speak. Voss cleared her throat, a soft sound that cut through the murmur like a blade. "Sir," she said, her voice low but clear, "it is not software. It is the sensor array." "The calibration is off by 3 microseconds. Adjust the timing cycle and the lag disappears." Merritt paused, his brow furrowing. He was a man who valued results over ego, but even he seemed surprised. "You sure, Captain?" he asked, not unkindly. Voss nodded once. "I ran the diagnostics last night. The data is on the server." Merritt studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, get it done." He moved on, but the room felt different now, a subtle charge in the air. A major from Intel leaned toward his aide, whispering something about Wraith and classified ops. Tanner, seated near the door with his motor pool crew, caught the exchange and frowned. Since when did a captain with a desk job know drone tech better than the eggheads in RD? The briefing ended, and the room emptied. Voss lingered, reviewing her tablet, her fingers moving with the precision of a pianist. Tanner, loitering near the door, couldn't resist. He sauntered over, his buddies trailing behind, their grins egging him on. "Hey, Captain," he said, leaning against a chair. "Nice trick with the drone thing. What, you read the manual for fun?" His tone was light, but his eyes were sharp, probing for a reaction. Voss looked up, her expression neutral. Up close, her scars were stark, a map of violence etched into her skin. She held his gaze, unblinking, and Tanner felt a prickle of unease like he'd stepped into a trap he couldn't see. "Private," she said, her voice even. "Focus on your job. It will keep you alive longer." She stood, her movements fluid, almost predatory, and brushed past him toward the exit. Tanner opened his mouth for a retort, but a hand clamped his shoulder. Staff Sergeant Lopez, his supervisor, her eyes hard as flint. "Enough, Tanner," she snapped. "You're embarrassing yourself." Tanner shrugged her off, muttering, but the words felt hollow, his bravado crumbling under the weight of something he couldn't name. Outside, the desert sun burned high, bleaching the tarmac to a pale shimmer. Voss stood alone near the hangar, her eyes on the horizon where F-35s traced contrails across the sky. Her hand rested on her neck, fingers brushing the scars, a gesture so fleeting it might have been unconscious. For a moment, her mask slipped, revealing a flicker of something, grief, resolve, a memory of fire and dust. Then it was gone, her face smooth as stone. The base hummed with its usual rhythm, jets roaring, trucks rumbling, voices shouting orders. But a new sound cut through. The whine of a Blackhawk approaching, its blades chopping the air. It touched down on a distant pad, and a figure stepped out, his silhouette broad, his uniform heavy with stars. General Amos Kane, commander of Air Combat Command, strode across the tarmac, his aides struggling to keep pace. The base snapped to attention, a ripple of salutes spreading like a wave. Kane's eyes swept the crowd, searching until they landed on Voss. She stood apart, her posture rigid, her eyes meeting his. The general stopped, his face softening with recognition. "Wraith," he said, his voice carrying over the wind. "Still hiding in plain sight?" The words were quiet, but they landed like a grenade. Heads turned, whispers sparked. Tanner, watching from the hangar, felt his stomach lurch. Kane raised a hand, a crisp salute. Not to the crowd, but to her, Captain Voss, the scarred pilot he'd mocked. The breach of protocol was staggering, a 4-star saluting a captain, and in that moment, the air shifted, heavy with the weight of a truth Tanner could not yet grasp. The Blackhawk's rotors slowed to a dull thump, kicking up dust that stung Tanner's eyes. He stood frozen at the edge of Hangar 12, his wrench dangling in his hand, as General Kane's salute to Captain Voss lingered in the air like a gunshot's echo. The Nellis tarmac buzzed with tension. Airmen and officers alike caught in a collective pause, their glances darting between the general and the scarred captain. Voss returned the salute with precision, her face betraying nothing, no pride, no discomfort, just the steady calm that Tanner was beginning to realize masked something vast. Kane lowered his hand, his gaze holding hers for a beat longer, then turned to Colonel Merritt, who had hustled forward, his face a mix of deference and confusion. "General, welcome to Nellis," Merritt said, his voice tight. "We weren't expecting you." Kane waved a hand, dismissive. "Unscheduled stop, Colonel. Had business in Vegas. Thought I'd see how my old stomping grounds are holding up." His tone was casual, but his eyes flicked back to Voss, who stood apart, her flight suit catching the harsh Nevada light. "And who's keeping you honest?" The words were light, almost playful, but they carried weight, a private history that made Merritt's jaw twitch. Tanner's crew muttered behind him, their bravado replaced by unease. "What the hell was that?" one whispered, nudging Tanner. "A 4-star saluting her? She's a captain." Tanner didn't answer. His mouth was dry, his earlier mockery replaying in his mind like a bad film. He watched as Kane gestured for Voss to join him, her boots scuffing the tarmac as she fell into step beside the general. They moved toward the command building, Merritt and a cluster of aides trailing like anxious shadows. The crowd dispersed, but the air crackled with questions no one dared voice aloud. Inside the command building, the fluorescent lights buzzed, casting stark shadows across the linoleum. Kane and Voss walked side by side, their silence comfortable, born of years and battles unspoken. Merritt followed, his discomfort palpable while the aides kept their distance, sensing the gravity of the moment. Kane's voice, when he spoke, was low, meant for Voss alone. "You're a hard woman to track, Wraith. Thought you'd be running a wing by now, or at least a desk at Langley." Voss's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Desks don't suit me, sir." "Too much paper, not enough sky." Kane chuckled, a sound like gravel shifting. "Still the same?" "You know, I half expected to find you in some war zone, not babysitting maintenance logs." Voss's eyes flicked to the floor, her fingers brushing the scars on her neck, a reflex, fleeting but telling. "Maintenance keeps the birds flying. That's enough." Her voice was even, but Kane's gaze softened, reading the weight behind her words. He stopped outside Merritt's office, turning to face her. "Elena," he said, dropping her call sign, "you can't hide forever. What you did, Blackstone, Kandahar, all of it, it's not just stories. It's history." Voss met his eyes, her expression unyielding. "History's for books, sir. I'm here to work." Kane studied her, then nodded, a silent concession. "Fair enough. But don't think you're invisible. Not to me." Merritt cleared his throat, eager to regain control. "General, my office is ready. We can brief you on operations if you'd like." Kane waved him off. "Later, Colonel." "I want a tour first. Captain Voss will show me around." Merritt blinked, caught off guard, but nodded. "Of course, sir." Voss didn't react, just gestured toward the hangar bay. "This way, General." As they walked, Tanner, lingering near a supply closet with a stack of folders, caught the exchange. His pulse quickened. Something about Voss, her calm, her scars, the way Kane spoke to her, felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. The hangar was alive with activity, mechanics shouting over the whine of drills, the tang of oil and metal thick in the air. Voss led Kane through the maze of equipment, her voice steady as she pointed out upgrades to the F-35's avionics. "We've cut diagnostic time by 20%, she said, pausing near a jet's open panel. "New software, better sensors." Kane nodded, but his eyes were on her, not the jet. "You always did see the details others missed. Saved my ass in 19 with that kind of thinking." Voss's posture stiffened, her hand grazing her neck again. "Just doing my job, sir." Kane's smile was wistful. "Your job's never been just anything, Elena." Tanner, tasked with hauling a crate of parts nearby, overheard the exchange. His hands fumbled, a bolt clattering to the floor. Kane's words, 19, saved my ass, rang in his ears. What had Voss done? The scars, the call sign, the general's deference, it didn't add up for a captain pushing maintenance reports. He glanced at Master Sergeant Rawls, who was watching from across the bay, his expression unreadable. Tanner's gut twisted. He'd been wrong about her, and the realization burned like acid. The tour continued, Voss and Kane moving to the flight line, where F-22s gleamed under the sun. Airmen saluted as they passed, but Kane's attention remained on Voss, his questions sharp, testing her knowledge of systems and tactics. She answered with precision, her voice never rising, her scars catching the light with every turn of her head. Tanner, trailing at a distance with his crew, noticed the senior NCOs watching her too, their nods subtle but reverent. Staff Sergeant Lopez appeared beside him, her voice low. "You're staring, Tanner. Focus on your work." He swallowed, his throat tight. "Who is she, Sarge? Really?" Lopez's eyes narrowed. "Someone you don't mock twice. Leave it at that." Back in the hangar, the day's rhythm resumed, but Tanner's mind was elsewhere. He replayed his taunts, roadkill, pretty face, and felt a flush of shame. He glanced at Voss, now alone near a diagnostic terminal, her fingers flying across the screen. Her solitude was deliberate, a wall built of silence and scars. He wanted to approach, to apologize, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he turned to Rawls, who was wiping grease from his hands. "Sarge," Tanner said, his voice low, "what's her deal? The general called her Wraith. Said she saved him." Rawls sighed, his eyes on Voss. "Kid, some stories aren't for you to know. But those scars, they're not from accidents. They're from pulling people out of hell. And she's still here, doing the job. That's all you need to understand." The day wound down, the hangar emptying as the sun dipped low, painting the desert in hues of fire. Voss stayed late, reviewing logs under the hum of fluorescent lights. Tanner, assigned to close up, lingered near the bay doors, watching her. Her focus was absolute, but her posture, slightly hunched, one hand tracing her neck, hinted at a weariness she never showed in public. He took a step toward her, then stopped. What could he say? Sorry didn't cut it, not after what he'd done. The door to the hangar swung open, and Colonel Merritt strode in, his face taut. "Captain Voss," he called, his voice clipped. She looked up, her expression neutral. "Sir?" Merritt hesitated, glancing at Tanner, then back to her. "General Keynes requested you for a classified brief tomorrow." "Su-600, secure room. It's about Blackstone." The name hung in the air, heavy with implication. Voss's eyes flickered, a shadow crossing her face, but she nodded. "Understood, sir." Merritt studied her, then softened. "Elena, you don't have to keep doing this, hiding in maintenance." "You're more than—" She cut him off, her voice firm. "This is where I'm needed, sir." Merritt sighed, then left, the door clanging shut behind him. Tanner stood frozen, the word Blackstone echoing in his mind. He didn't know what it meant, but the way Merritt said it, the way Voss reacted, it was a wound, still raw. She returned to her work, but her movements were slower now, her mask slipping just enough to reveal a flicker of pain. Tanner's chest tightened. He'd misjudged her, not just as a soldier but as a person, and the weight of that mistake pressed down like the desert heat. He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "Private," she said, not looking up. "You're still here." He swallowed, his heart pounding. "Ma'am, She raised a hand, silencing him. "Words are cheap." "Show me you're better." She met his eyes, her gaze piercing, and in that moment, Tanner felt seen, not as a cocky kid, but as someone who could still change. The pre-dawn chill seeped through the cracks of Nellis Air Force Base, the desert air sharp enough to bite. At 0530, the base was a shadow of itself. Runway lights glowing faintly, the hum of generators a low pulse in the dark. Captain Elena Voss stood outside the secure briefing room, her breath visible in the cold, her flight suit zipped to her chin. The scars on her neck itched under the fabric, a reminder of nights like this in places far less forgiving. She adjusted her posture, shoulders square, eyes scanning the empty corridor. No one else was here yet. Good. Silence was her ally, a space to brace for what lay ahead. Inside, the room was stark. A long table, a projector, a single window blacked out for security. Voss took her place at the far end, her tablet open to a classified file marked Blackstone. The word alone was enough to tighten her chest, to summon memories of smoke and screams, of decisions that saved lives, but left her broken. She forced her breathing steady, her fingers tracing the edge of the tablet, grounding herself in the present. The door opened and General Kane entered, his presence filling the room like a storm front. Colonel Merritt followed, his face drawn, and a civilian in a tailored suit. Likely CIA, Voss noted, from the way he moved, all angles and no warmth. "Captain," Kane said, his voice warm but formal. He took a seat across from her, his eyes searching her face. "You look like you haven't slept." Voss met his gaze, her expression neutral. "Sleep's overrated, sir." Kane's mouth twitched, a flicker of amusement, but the civilian, introduced as Mr. Hargrove, cut through the moment. "Let's keep this efficient," he said, his voice clipped. "Blackstone's unresolved. We have new intel suggesting the network's active again. Same players, same tactics." He slid a folder across the table, its contents redacted save for a grainy photo of a man in desert fatigues, his face half hidden by shadow. Voss studied the image, her pulse quickening. She knew that profile, that tilt of the head. Her fingers brushed her neck, the scars burning with memory. "Khalid," she said softly, the name a blade. Hargrove raised an eyebrow. "You're quick, yes?" "Khalid al-Masri. Thought to be KIA after your op in 19. Turns out he's alive, and he's moving." Kane leaned forward, his voice low. "Elena, you're the only one who's faced him and walked away. We need your insight. Patterns, weaknesses, anything." Voss's jaw tightened. She wanted to say no, to walk out and leave Blackstone buried, but duty was a chain, and she was still bound. "I'll review the file, sir." "Give me a day." Hargrove scoffed. "A day? Captain, this is time-sensitive." Kane silenced him with a look. "She said a day. She gets a day." The general's tone brooked no argument. Merritt, silent until now, cleared his throat. "Captain, are you sure you're up for this? After everything?" Voss's eyes flicked to him, hard as flint. "I'm sure, sir." The room fell quiet, the weight of her words settling like dust. Kane nodded, satisfied, and the briefing ended with orders to reconvene at 1800. Outside, the base was waking, the first jets screaming into the sky. Voss stood on the tarmac, the file tucked under her arm, her gaze distant. The scars on her neck throbbed, a pulse of memory. Khalid's voice, smooth as oil, promising death. The blast that tore her team apart. The weight of a wounded pilot in her arms as she ran through fire. She closed her eyes, forcing the images down, but they lingered, sharp as shrapnel. A voice broke her reverie. Private Tanner, hesitant, approaching with a crate of tools. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low. "You okay?" She opened her eyes, her mask back in place. "Fine, Private. Get to work." He nodded, but his eyes lingered, seeing more than she wanted. The hangar was a hive of noise and motion, the smell of jet fuel thick in the air. Tanner joined his crew, his hands busy but his mind elsewhere. He'd overheard snippets in the motor pool. whispers of Blackstone, of a mission so classified it was a ghost story among the enlisted. Voss was at the center of it, her scars a map of that secret war. He watched her across the bay, briefing a team of mechanics on a hydraulic issue. Her voice was calm, her gestures precise, but there was a tension in her posture, a coiled spring ready to snap. Tanner's chest tightened. He'd mocked her, called her roadkill, and now he saw the truth. She was a warrior, carrying wounds he couldn't fathom. Master Sergeant Rawls appeared beside him, wiping grease from his hands. "You're quiet today, kid," he said, his eyes on Voss. "Learning something?" Tanner swallowed, his throat dry. "She's different, Sarge." "The general, that briefing. What's Blackstone?" Rawls's face hardened. "Not your business. But I'll tell you this. Those scars. She got 'em saving people who'd be dead otherwise, and she's still here doing the job. That's who she is." Tanner nodded, the weight of his ignorance pressing down. He wanted to make it right. But how? Midday, the hangar cleared for a scheduled drill, leaving Voss alone at a diagnostic station. She worked in silence, her focus absolute, but her hands trembled slightly, betraying the strain of the morning's briefing. Tanner, tasked with inventory, lingered nearby, his courage building. He approached, his boots scuffing the concrete. "Captain," he said, his voice cracking. She looked up, her eyes sharp but not unkind. "Private." He took a breath, the words spilling out. "I was wrong. About you, about everything. I didn't know who you were, I'm sorry." Voss studied him, her expression unreadable. For a moment he thought she'd dismiss him, but she leaned back, her fingers brushing her neck. "You didn't know," she said, her voice low. "But you're learning." "That's more than most." Tanner nodded, relief mixing with shame. "Why do you stay here, ma'am? Maintenance after whatever you did?" Voss's eyes flickered, a shadow of pain crossing her face. "Because fixing things keeps me grounded, and someone has to." She stood, gathering her tools, but paused. "Private, you want to be better?" "Listen more, judge less." She walked away, leaving Tanner with a truth he wasn't ready to carry. As the sun sank, painting the desert in blood-red hues, Voss stood outside the hangar, the Blackstone file in her hands. The weight of it was more than paper. It was a summons, a pull back to a life she'd tried to leave behind. Across the tarmac, Tanner watched her, his resolve hardening. He didn't know her story, but he knew one thing. She was no roadkill. She was Wraith, and whatever came next, he'd be watching, learning, hoping to earn the respect he'd so carelessly thrown away. Voss turned, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting moment, and in that glance, he saw a storm brewing, one that would test her silence and her strength. The Nevada dusk bled orange across the horizon, casting long shadows over Nellis Air Force Base. Hangar 12 stood quiet, its bay doors half closed, the hum of machinery replaced by the distant howl of a coyote. Captain Elena Voss sat alone at a workbench, the Blackstone file open before her, its pages a maze of redacted text and grainy surveillance photos. Her fingers hovered over a map of the Syrian desert, tracing a route she knew by heart. Every wadi, every ridge, every place where blood had soaked the sand. The scars on her neck burned, a phantom pain that flared with memory. She closed her eyes, her breathing shallow, and saw Khalid al-Masri's face, his smile cold as a blade, promising retribution. Footsteps broke her focus. Private Tanner approached, a stack of maintenance logs under his arm, his face hesitant but determined. He stopped a respectful distance away, his boots scuffing the concrete. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, "I was told to deliver these." Voss opened her eyes, her expression a wall of calm. She nodded, gesturing to the bench. "Leave them there." Tanner set the logs down, but lingered, his hands fidgeting. She raised an eyebrow, a silent question. He took a breath, the words tumbling out. "Captain, I meant what I said earlier. I'm sorry. I didn't know about you, about anything. I want to make it right." Voss studied him, her gaze piercing but not cruel. His sincerity was raw, unpolished. A boy trying to be a man. She leaned back, her fingers brushing the scars on her neck, a gesture that felt like confession. "You cannot undo words, Private," she said, her voice even. "But you can change what comes next. Focus on that." Tanner nodded, his throat tight. He wanted to ask about Blackstone, about the scars, about the general's salute, but her silence was a boundary he dared not cross. He saluted, awkward but earnest, and left, the weight of her words settling like dust. The hangar's fluorescent lights flickered, casting harsh shadows across the workbench. Voss returned to the file, her mind a battlefield of memory and strategy. Khalid was alive. The intel was thin. Sightings in Aleppo, encrypted chatter, a weapons cache linked to his network, but it was enough to resurrect ghosts. She remembered the night in 19, the ambush in Deir ez-Zor, her team pinned under fire. She'd dragged Lieutenant Hayes to safety, his blood soaking her arms, her neck torn open by shrapnel. Khalid had watched from a ridge, his silhouette etched against the flames, and she'd sworn he'd smiled. She'd killed his lieutenants, crippled his operation, but he'd slipped away. Now he was back, and the CIA wanted her to finish what she'd started. The door to the hangar creaked open and Master Sergeant Rawls stepped in, his face weathered, his eyes sharp. He carried a thermos of coffee, a peace offering. "Burning the midnight oil, Captain?" he asked, setting the thermos beside her. Voss nodded, her lips twitching, not quite a smile. "Something like that." Rawls glanced at the file, his expression darkening. "Blackstone," he said, not a question. "Heard whispers. Bad business." Voss met his gaze, a silent acknowledgement. Rawls had been at Bagram in 19, a maintenance chief who'd seen her come off the medevac, half dead but still giving orders. He knew enough to know better than to ask. "General's got you on a leash," Rawls said, pouring coffee into a chipped mug. "You don't have to say yes." Voss took the mug, the heat grounding her. "I do," she said simply. "Khalid's not a ghost you leave wandering." Rawls sighed, his hands resting on the workbench. "You're not the only one who can fight him, Elena." "You've given enough." Her eyes flickered, a shadow of pain crossing her face. "Not enough," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not while he's breathing." Rawls studied her, then nodded, a soldier recognizing a battle that wasn't his to fight. Outside the base was a constellation of lights, jets silent for the night. Tanner, unable to sleep, lingered near the motor pool, his hands greasy from a late repair. He'd seen Voss and Rawls through the hangar's open door, their silhouettes stark against the light. He couldn't hear their words, but the tension was palpable, a current that pulled at him. He thought of his father, a Marine who'd died in Fallujah, his stories of heroes who never sought glory. Tanner had laughed at Voss, called her roadkill, but now he saw her scars for what they were, proof of a life spent running toward danger, not away. Shame burned in his chest, but so did something new. Resolve. Morning broke harsh and bright, the desert sun unforgiving. The secure briefing room was crowded now. Kane, Merritt, Hargrove, and a handful of intel officers, their faces grim. Voss stood at the head of the table, a projector casting maps and timelines behind her. Her voice was steady, clinical, as she outlined Khalid's patterns. His preference for urban strongholds, his use of decoys, his obsession with symbolic targets. "He'll hit a civilian site," she said, pointing to a map of Damascus. A market, a hospital. He wants chaos, not precision. Hargrove leaned forward, skeptical. You're guessing, Captain. We need hard targets. Voss's eyes hardened. I know him, she said, her tone cutting. You want targets? Give me access to the Aleppo intercepts. I'll find them. Kane nodded, overriding Hargrove's protest. Do it. Full access. The room shifted, the officers murmuring, impressed or uneasy. Merritt watched Voss, his expression conflicted. He'd known her as a pilot, a maintenance officer, but this, Wraith, the tactician, was a side he'd only heard in whispers. As the briefing ended, Voss gathered her notes, her movements precise, but her hands trembling, a crack in her armor. Tanner, assigned to escort the officers to their transport, caught the moment. He saw the strain in her eyes, the weight of a past she carried alone, and felt a pang of guilt for ever adding to it. The day unfolded in a blur of activity, the base on edge with rumors of a high-stakes op. Tanner worked in the motor pool, his hands steady but his mind racing. He overheard snippets from the crew chiefs. Blackstone was a rescue mission gone wrong, a betrayal, a bloodbath. Voss had been the only one to walk away, and even that was a miracle. He wanted to ask her, to understand, but she was untouchable, a figure moving through the base like a shadow. By afternoon, he found himself near her station, delivering a repaired diagnostic tool. She was alone, reviewing satellite imagery, her face drawn. Private, she said, not looking up. You're hovering. Tanner flushed, caught. Ma'am, I heard about Blackstone. I don't know what it is, but I know it's big, and I know you're in the middle of it. Voss's hand paused, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, she was not Wraith, not the legend, just a woman, tired and human. Some fights choose you, she said, her voice low. You don't get to walk away. She stood, her scars catching the light, and walked past him, leaving a silence that felt like a challenge. Tanner watched her go, his resolve hardening. He didn't know her war, but he'd prove he could stand in its shadow. The Nellis command center thrummed with tension, its air thick with the scent of burnt coffee and static from overworked monitors. At 0200, the room was a hive of focused chaos. Intel officers hunched over laptops, their screens glowing with satellite feeds and encrypted chatter. Captain Elena Voss stood at the center, her flight suit rumpled, her scars stark under the fluorescent glare. She leaned over a digital map, her finger tracing a grid of Aleppo's Warren-like streets. The Blackstone file lay open beside her, its pages dog-eared, annotated in her precise script. Khalid al-Masri's face stared from a photo pinned to the wall, his eyes mocking her across the years. General Kane watched from the sidelines, his arms crossed, his presence a steady anchor. Colonel Merritt hovered nearby, his face etched with worry, while Mr. Hargrove, the CIA man, paced, his impatience a low simmer. Voss ignored them all, her focus absolute. Here, she said, tapping a market square on the map. Khalid's using the civilian density as cover. He'll stage from the souk, move at dusk. It's his pattern. Her voice was calm, but her hand trembled, a fleeting betrayal of the strain within. Hargrove snorted. Pattern? That's a hunch, Captain. We need coordinates, not guesswork. Voss's eyes flicked to him, cold as steel. Check the intercepts from 2300. Truck movements, encrypted bursts. It's him. An intel officer, a young lieutenant with tired eyes, nodded and pulled up the data. The room stilled as lines of code scrolled across the screen, confirming Voss's analysis. Kane's mouth twitched, a ghost of pride. Good work, Wraith, he said, low enough for only her to hear. She didn't respond, her gaze back on the map, her fingers brushing the scars on her neck. The gesture was unconscious, but it spoke of Deir ez-Zor, Flames licking the sky, her team's screams, Khalid's silhouette vanishing into the dust. She'd failed to stop him then. She wouldn't now. The briefing stretched into dawn, the desert sun creeping through the blinds, painting the room in slats of gold. Voss outlined a plan. A drone strike to disrupt Khalid's supply line, timed to avoid civilian casualties. Her voice never wavered, but her eyes were haunted, weighing each word against the cost of failure. Merritt hesitated, then spoke. "Elena, this is high risk. If you're wrong, the blowback—" She cut him off, her tone sharp. "I'm not wrong, sir." Khalid doesn't wait. We move now or we lose him. Kane nodded, decisive. Approved. "Get the drones prepped. Captain, you're on point." Outside, the base roared to life, jets screaming across the sky, their contrails slashing the morning. Private Tanner worked in the motor pool, his hands greasy from a fuel pump repair, his mind on Voss. He'd seen her leave the command center, her posture rigid, her face a mask of resolve. The rumors had spread. Blackstone was no ghost story but a living wound, and Voss was its beating heart. He wanted to help, to prove he was more than his mistakes, but he was just a private, invisible in her world. Still, he watched her, noting the way senior NCOs nodded as she passed, their respect a silent hymn. In the hangar, Voss oversaw the drone prep, her voice cutting through the clatter of tools. "Check the sensor calibration," she told a technician, her tone firm but patient. "We can't afford a misfire." The tech nodded, awed by her precision, unaware of the war raging behind her eyes. Master Sergeant Rawls lingered nearby, his thermos of coffee a constant companion. "You're pushing hard, Captain," he said, his voice low. "When's the last time you ate?" Voss's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "I'll eat when he's done." Rawls sighed, his eyes on her scars. "You can't carry this alone, Elena." "Let us help." She met his gaze, a flicker of gratitude buried in her steel. "I know, Rawls, but this one's mine." Tanner, delivering a crate of parts, overheard the exchange. His chest tightened. He saw her now, not as roadkill, not as a captain, but as Wraith, a woman forged in fire, carrying a burden she'd never share. He approached, hesitant, his boots loud against the concrete. "Ma'am," he said, setting the crate down. "Anything I can do?" Voss looked up, her eyes assessing. For a moment he thought she'd dismiss him, but she nodded. "Check the fuel lines on Drone 3, double time." It was a small task, but her trust, however slight, felt like absolution. Tanner saluted, his heart pounding, and got to work. The day blurred into evening, the base on high alert as the drone op loomed. Voss stood on the tarmac, watching the birds lift off, their silhouettes stark against the sunset. The command center was a pressure cooker, monitors tracking the drone's path over Aleppo. Voss sat at a console, her headset crackling with updates, her face unreadable. Kane stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder, a rare gesture of support. "You've got this," he said. She nodded, but her fingers gripped the console, white-knuckled, as the first images flickered in. The souk, crowded with vendors, the target zone a maze of alleys. The strike was surgical, the drones hitting a warehouse on the market's edge. The feed showed flames, then dust, then nothing, static as the signal cut. The room held its breath, waiting for confirmation. An intel officer broke the silence. "Target destroyed. No civilian casualties reported." A murmur of relief swept through, but Voss didn't relax. Her eyes stayed on the screen, searching for Khalid's shadow. Hargrove clapped, smug. "Nice work, Captain. Maybe you're not just a hunch after all." She ignored him, her voice low as she spoke into the headset. "Ground team, confirm the body count." "I need eyes on Khalid." Hours later, the report came. No Khalid. The warehouse was his, the weapons his, but he'd slipped away, a ghost in the chaos. Voss's jaw tightened, her scars burning with the old pain. She'd hit him, but not hard enough. Kane's hand returned to her shoulder. "You did what you could, Elena." "We'll get him." She nodded, but her eyes were distant, lost in the desert of 19. Merritt approached, his voice soft. "Go rest, Captain. That's an order." She stood, saluting, but her steps were heavy as she left the room. Outside, the night was cold, the stars sharp as shrapnel. Tanner, finishing a late shift, saw Voss on the tarmac, alone, her silhouette small against the vast dark. She stood still, her hand on her neck, her gaze on the horizon where the drones had flown. He wanted to speak, to offer something, anything, but her solitude was a fortress. Instead, he watched, his resolve deepening. She was Wraith, but she was human, and he'd learn from her, not just as a soldier, but as someone who'd seen hell and kept walking. Voss turned, her eyes catching his in the dark. For a moment, she held his gaze, a silent acknowledgement of his presence, his change. Then she walked away, the Blackstone file tucked under her arm, her scars a map of battles yet to come. Tanner stood rooted, the night closing around him, knowing the war wasn't over, not for her, and now, not for him. The Nellie's tarmac shimmered under a relentless noon sun, heat rising in waves that distorted the horizon. Hangar 12 bustled with the clatter of tools and the sharp tang of hydraulic fluid, but a hush fell as Captain Elena Voss crossed the bay, her flight suit dark with sweat, her scars glinting like silver threads. She carried a tablet, its screen dense with drone telemetry, but her eyes were distant, fixed on a point no one else could see. Khalid al-Masri's escape gnawed at her, a wound as raw as the scars on her neck. She'd struck his operation, but he was a shadow, always one step ahead. Private Tanner watched from the motor pool, his hands paused on a fuel filter, his gaze tracking Voss's path. Since the drone strike, the base had shifted. Rumors of Blackstone swirled, painting Voss as both hero and enigma. Tanner's shame had hardened into purpose. He studied her now, not with mockery, but with a hunger to understand. He noticed the way her fingers brushed her neck when she thought no one was looking, the way senior NCOs stood straighter in her presence. He wanted to earn that respect, to prove he'd changed, but the gap between them felt like a chasm. Voss stopped at a diagnostic station, her voice low as she guided a young technician through a sensor recalibration. "Check the alignment," she said, her tone patient but firm. "Even a micron off can throw the whole system." The tech nodded, awed, her hands moving faster under Voss's scrutiny. Master Sergeant Rawls lingered nearby, his thermos of coffee a familiar prop. He caught Tanner's eye and jerked his head, a silent summons. Tanner approached, wiping grease from his hands, his pulse quickening. "Kid," Rawls said, his voice low, "you're staring again. Either say something or get back to work." Tanner swallowed, his throat dry. "I want to help her, Sarge. After the strike, she's different. Like she's carrying something." Rawls' eyes narrowed, assessing. "She's carrying more than you'll ever know, but you want to help. Do your job. Be someone she can count on." Tanner nodded, the words sinking deep. He glanced at Voss, her focus absolute, and felt a spark of resolve. He'd start small, prove himself in the work, the way she did. The afternoon brought a surprise, an unscheduled briefing in the command center. Voss entered to find General Kane, Colonel Merritt, and Mr. Hargrove waiting, their faces grim. A new intel packet lay on the table, its cover stamped eyes only. Kane gestured for her to sit, his voice steady but heavy. "Elena, we've got a problem." "Khalid's moved faster than we thought. He's planning a hit, big, Public, somewhere in Europe. We don't have a location yet, but the chatter's spiking. Hargrove slid a photo across the table. A grainy image of a shipping container, its contents obscured but ominous. Weapons grade, he said. Likely chemical. Your strike slowed him, but it didn't stop him. Voss's jaw tightened, her fingers grazing her neck, the scars a pulse of memory. She saw dear Azor again, her team's blood on her hands, Khalid's taunting smile. He's escalating, she said, her voice low. He wants to draw us out, force a mistake. Kane nodded, his eyes searching hers. We need a plan, Wraith. Something surgical. You're the best shot we've got. Hargrove scoffed, but Kane silenced him with a glance. Voss leaned forward, her mind racing, mapping Khalid's tactics against the new intel. Give me the raw data, she said. I'll find his next move. The briefing stretched into evening, the room a pressure cooker of strategy and doubt. Voss outlined a counter-op. Infiltrate Khalid's supply chain, tag his weapons, track him to the target. It was bold, high risk, and required her in the field, something Merritt opposed. Captain, you're too valuable here, he said, his voice tight. Let the teams handle it. Voss's eyes flashed, a rare crack in her calm. No one knows him like I do, sir. I go, or we fail. Kane studied her, then nodded. You're cleared. Pick your team. Wheels up in 48 hours. Outside, the desert night was sharp, the stars a cold fire. Voss stood alone near the runway, the intel packet under her arm, her breath visible in the chill. She felt the weight of the mission, the ghosts of her past clawing at her resolve. Tanner, finishing a late shift, saw her from the motor pool. Her solitude was a beacon, drawing him closer despite his fear. He approached, his boots loud against the asphalt. Ma'am, he said, his voice hesitant. I heard about the op. I know I'm nobody, but if you need anything, I'm here. Voss turned, her eyes assessing, a flicker of surprise in their depths. You're not nobody, Private, she said, her tone soft but firm. You're learning. That's enough for now. Tanner nodded, his chest tight with gratitude. He wanted to say more, to ask about Khalid, about the scars, but her gaze held a boundary he respected. She walked away, her silhouette merging with the dark, leaving him with a sense of purpose he hadn't known he could feel. Back in the hangar, he worked with a new focus, his hands steady, his mind replaying her words. He'd be ready, not just for her, but for the soldier he wanted to become. The next morning, Voss assembled her team in a secure hangar. 2 special ops veterans, a drone tech, and an intel analyst. She briefed them with precision, her voice a blade cutting through their doubts. Khalid's smart, she said, pointing to a map of Istanbul, the likely target. He'll use civilians as shields, blend into the crowd. We tag the weapons, we follow the trail, we end him. Her team nodded, their trust in her absolute, forged in the shadow of her legend. Rawls watched from the sidelines, his face unreadable, but his eyes heavy with worry. Be careful, Elena, he said as the briefing ended. You're not invincible. She met his gaze, a ghost of a smile on her lips. Never thought I was, Rawls. Tanner, tasked with prepping the team's gear, overheard the exchange. He saw the strain in Voss's posture, the way her hand lingered on her neck, and felt a pang of helplessness. He wanted to protect her, to share the burden, but he was just a private, his world too small for hers. Still, he worked with care, double-checking every piece of equipment, knowing it might save her life. As the team loaded into a transport, Voss caught his eye, a nod of acknowledgement that felt like a lifeline. He saluted, his heart pounding, and watched the plane lift off, its roar swallowing the silence she left behind. The Istanbul night was a tapestry of chaos and light, the Grand Bazaar's alleys pulsing with voices, spices, and the clink of coins. Captain Elena Voss moved through the crowd, her civilian clothes, a worn jacket, dark scarf, blending her into the throng. Her scars were hidden beneath the scarf's fold, but her eyes, sharp and unyielding, missed nothing. She carried a concealed comms unit, its faint buzz a lifeline to her team, dispersed across the city. The mission was clear. Tag Khalid al-Masri's chemical weapons, track his movements, neutralize the threat. But the air was thick with danger, every shadow a potential trap. Voss paused near a tea vendor, her posture casual but her senses razor-sharp. Her team's voices crackled in her ear. Lieutenant Chen, the drone tech, monitoring from a rooftop, Sergeant Diaz, special ops, tailing a suspect, and Analyst Patel, sifting data in a safe house. Target's convoy sighted, Patel reported, her voice tense. 2 trucks, northwest quadrant, heading for the docks. Voss nodded, her fingers brushing the tracker in her pocket, a device small enough to pass as litter, but precise enough to guide a missile.
"Copy," she said, her voice low. "Diaz, close the gap. Chen, keep the drone high."
Back at Nellis, the command center was a pressure cooker, monitors glowing with live feeds from Istanbul. General Kane stood at the forefront, his face carved from stone, while Colonel Merritt paced, his hands clasped tight. Private Tanner, relegated to support duties, watched from the sidelines, his heart in his throat. He'd prepped the team's gear, checked every bolt, every wire, knowing it was for Voss, for Wraith. The screens showed grainy images of the bazaar, Voss's silhouette a ghost among the crowd. Tanner's chest ached with pride and fear. He'd mocked her once, but now he saw her truth, a warrior who walked into hell without flinching. In Istanbul, Voss slipped into an alley, the stink of diesel and rotting fruit heavy in the air. Diaz's voice came through, urgent. "Trucks stopped." Dockside warehouse, heavily guarded. Voss's jaw tightened, her scars throbbing with memory. Khalid's ambushes were never simple. She moved toward the docks, her steps silent, her mind mapping the terrain from satellite images she'd memorized. The warehouse loomed ahead, its rusted walls lit by flickering sodium lamps. She spotted the trucks, their cargo covered but ominous, and Khalid's men, hard-eyed, armed, patrolling with disciplined precision.
"Chen, get me eyes inside,"
Voss whispered, crouching behind a stack of crates. The drone's feed flickered in her comms unit, revealing crates stamped with hazard symbols, chemical agents, just as Hargrove feared. Her pulse quickened, but her hands were steady as she activated the tracker, tossing it with a flick of her wrist. It landed beneath a truck, its signal pinging to the safe house. "Tagged," she said. "Patel, lock it in." Patel's voice was calm but strained. "Got it. Signal's live." "But Captain, there's chatter. Khalid's here. He knows we're close." Voss froze, her breath catching. She saw him then, across the dockyard, his silhouette unmistakable, tall, lean, moving with the grace of a predator. Khalid al-Masri, alive, his face half lit by a cigarette's glow. Her scars burned, a scream of memory. Dear as Zor, her team slaughtered, his voice promising she'd never win. She wanted to rush him, to end it, but duty held her fast. "Diaz, hold position," she ordered, her voice steel. "We track. We don't engage." Diaz grunted, reluctant but obedient. "Copy, Wraith." At Nellis, the command center erupted in hushed urgency as the drone feed showed Khalid. Kane's eyes narrowed, his voice low. "She's got him in her sights. Stay sharp." Tanner clenched his fists, his nails biting his palms. He saw Voss's resolve in the feed, her body coiled, ready to strike or flee. He thought of her scars, her silence, the weight she carried alone. He wanted to be there, to stand with her, but all he could do was watch, his shame a distant echo, his respect a living flame. In Istanbul, the mission unraveled. A guard spotted the drone's glint, and gunfire shattered the night. Voss dove for cover, her comms crackling with chaos. "Chen, pull back!" she barked, drawing her sidearm, a last resort. Diaz reported in, breathless. "They're moving the trucks!" "Khalid's bolting." Voss cursed under her breath, her mind racing. She sprinted toward the warehouse, her scarf falling, her scars exposed to the night. The tracker's signal was live, but Khalid was slipping away, his men laying down, suppressing fire. She reached the warehouse's edge, her back against cold metal, bullets pinging nearby. Patel's voice cut through, urgent. "Captain, the tracker's moving! East toward the Bosphorus!" "You've got a window, but it's tight." Voss nodded, her eyes on Khalid's retreating figure. She could chase him, risk everything or fall back, preserve the mission. Her hand brushed her neck, the scars a map of choices made in blood. "Diaz, flank them," she ordered. "Chen, keep the drone on the trucks. I'm going for Khalid." At Nellis, the command center held its breath, the feed showing Voss's pursuit. Tanner's heart pounded, his eyes locked on her image, small, fierce, a shadow against the firelight. Merritt muttered, "She's too close." But Kane silenced him. "She knows what she's doing." Tanner believed it, but fear gnawed at him. He saw her scars in his mind, proof of her survival, and prayed they weren't a prelude to sacrifice. Voss closed the distance, her boots pounding the dockside gravel, Khalid's silhouette just ahead. He turned, his eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, time stopped. His smile was the same, cruel, knowing. Then he vanished into an alley, his men closing ranks. Voss fired, dropping one, but the others returned fire, forcing her back. Her comms buzzed with Diaz's voice. "Wraith, we've got the trucks pinned. Tracker's holding." She exhaled, her chest tight. Khalid was gone, but the weapons were tagged, the mission intact. She retreated, her scars burning, her resolve unbroken. Back at the safe house, Voss debriefed her team, her voice steady but her hands trembling. "We got the weapons," she said, her eyes on the tracker's signal, now feeding to a NATO strike team. "Khalid's wounded, but he's not done." Chen nodded, her face pale. "You saw him, Captain. That's more than anyone's done in years." Voss didn't respond, her fingers brushing her neck, the scars a reminder of the cost. She'd face him again, and next time, she'd end it. At Nellis, the command center exhaled, the mission deemed a success despite Khalid's escape. Tanner, dismissed from duty, stood outside, the desert night cold against his skin. He thought of Voss, halfway across the world, her scars a testament to battles he'd never know. He'd prepped her gear, a small act, but it had mattered. He vowed to do more, to be a soldier she'd trust, not just a private who'd learned too late. As the stars burned overhead, he felt the weight of her fight, and for the first time, he wanted to carry it too. The Nellis dawn broke in a blaze of crimson, the desert air heavy with the promise of heat. Hangar 12 stood silent, its bay doors open to the morning, the faint hum of cooling fans the only sound. Captain Elena Voss sat at a workbench, her flight suit unbuttoned at the collar, her scars exposed like battle lines on a map. The Istanbul op had been a partial victory. Khalid al-Masri's weapons tagged, his network exposed, but he remained a ghost, slipping through her fingers. The weight of that failure pressed against her chest, her fingers tracing the jagged lines on her neck, each scar a story of survival and loss. Private Tanner approached, a stack of maintenance reports in hand, his steps hesitant but deliberate. He'd changed since his first days at Nellis, his cocky smirk gone, replaced by a quiet determination to prove himself. He stopped a few feet away, clearing his throat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady, "these are for you, from Rawls." Voss looked up, her eyes assessing, a flicker of recognition in their depths. She took the reports, her fingers brushing the paper, and nodded.
Thank you, Private.
Tanner lingered, his hands clasped behind his back.
Heard about Istanbul, he said, softer now. They're saying you saved lives.
Again. Voss's lips twitched, not quite a smile. They say a lot of things. Get back to work. Tanner saluted, but his eyes held hers a moment longer, seeing the exhaustion she hid from others. He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him.
Private,
she said, her tone softer, almost human.
You're doing better.
Keep it up. The words were simple, but they landed like a medal, heavy with meaning. Tanner nodded, his chest swelling, and walked away, vowing to carry her trust like a shield. The command center was a hive of aftermath, officers and analysts sifting through Istanbul's fallout. General Kane stood before a wall of monitors, his face lined with resolve, while Colonel Merritt reviewed reports, his brow furrowed. Voss entered, her posture rigid, the Blackstone file under her arm. Kane turned, his eyes softening. "Wraith," he said, gesturing to a chair. "Sit, you look like hell." Voss sat, her scars catching the light, her voice steady. "Khalid's gone to ground, sir, but the tracker's data gave us his lieutenants. NATO's moving on them now." Kane nodded, pride in his gaze. "You bought us time, Elena. That's more than we had." Mr. Hargrove, the CIA liaison, leaned against a desk, his skepticism undimmed. "Time's not enough, Captain. Khalid's still out there planning his next hit." Voss's jaw tightened, her fingers brushing her neck, the scars a pulse of memory. Khalid's smile in Deir ez-Zor, her team's blood on her hands. "He's wounded," she said, her voice cold. "He'll make a mistake. I'll be ready." Hargrove opened his mouth to argue, but Kane cut him off. "She's right. We trust Wraith, always have." Merritt glanced at Voss, his concern evident. "Elena, you've done enough. Let the teams take it from here." She met his gaze, unyielding. "Not yet, sir. Not until he's done." The meeting ended with orders to monitor Khalid's network. Voss tasked with leading the analysis. She left the room, the file a weight in her hands, her steps heavy with purpose. Outside, the tarmac shimmered, jets roaring into the sky, their contrails a fleeting map of freedom. Tanner watched from the motor pool, his hands busy with a hydraulic pump, his mind on Voss. He'd heard the whispers. Her team in Istanbul had faced death, and she'd walked them through it, her scars a testament to battles won and lost. He wanted to stand with her, to be more than a private. But for now, he'd learn, his every task a step toward redemption. Midday brought a rare moment of calm. Voss stood alone in Hangar 12, reviewing drone logs, her focus absolute, but her posture weary. Master Sergeant Rawls appeared, his thermos of coffee a familiar comfort. "You're gonna burn out, Captain," he said, pouring her a cup. "Even Wraith needs a break." Voss took the coffee, her fingers curling around the warmth. "Not today, Rawls. Khalid's close." "I can feel it." Rawls sighed, his eyes on her scars. "You've been chasing him for years, Elena. What happens when you catch him?" She looked away, her gaze distant, the scars throbbing with memory. "I'll know when it happens," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Tanner, delivering a crate of parts, overheard the exchange. He saw the pain in Voss's eyes, the weight of a war she fought alone, and felt a surge of loyalty. He approached, his voice low. "Ma'am, if you need anything, gear, reports, anything, I'm here." Voss studied him, her expression softening, a rare glimpse of the woman behind the legend. "You're persistent, Private," she said, a hint of warmth in her tone. "All right, check the drone sensors for tomorrow's test. Be thorough." Tanner saluted, his heart racing, and got to work, each task a chance to prove he'd changed. Evening fell. the desert sky a canvas of fire and shadow. Voss stood on the tarmac, the Blackstone file open in her hands, her eyes scanning new intel. A coded message, intercepted hours ago, hinting at Khalid's next move, a port in Athens, a shipment, a deadline. Her scars burned, a warning and a promise. She'd face him again, and this time, she'd end it. But the cost loomed, a shadow she couldn't outrun. She thought of her team in 19, their faces lost to fire, and of Tanner, his earnest resolve a mirror of her younger self. She'd protect him, protect them all, even if it meant breaking herself. Tanner, finishing his shift, saw her from the hangar, her silhouette small against the vast night. He wanted to speak, to offer something, but her solitude was sacred, a space he respected. Instead, he worked late, double-checking the sensors she'd assigned, his hands steady, his purpose clear. He'd mocked her once, called her roadkill, but now he saw her scars for what they were, badges of valor, earned in shadows. He'd be her soldier, not just in rank, but in spirit, ready for the fight she'd never share. Voss turned, her eyes catching his across the tarmac, a silent acknowledgement of his growth, his loyalty. For a moment, she let her mask slip, revealing a flicker of hope, a belief that her fight might live on in those she'd taught. Then she walked away, the file clutched tight, her scars a map of battles past and future. Tanner stood rooted, the night closing around him, knowing her war wasn't over, but vowing to stand in its light, ready to learn, to fight, to honor the wraith who'd shown him what valor truly meant.